In Search of the Miraculous, Chapter 6. One of the next lectures began with a question asked by one of those present. What was the aim of his teaching? I certainly have an aim of my own, said G, but you must permit me to keep silent about it. At the present moment my aim cannot have any meaning for you, because it is important that you should define your own aim. The teaching by itself cannot pursue any definite aim. It can only show the best way for men to attain whatever aims they may have. The question of aim is a very important question. Until a man has defined his own aim for himself, he will not be able even to begin to do anything. How is it possible to do anything without having an aim? Before anything else, doing presupposes an aim. But the question of the aim of existence is one of the most difficult of philosophical questions, said one of those present. You want us to begin by solving this question, but perhaps we have come here because we are seeking an answer to this question. You expect us to have known it beforehand. If a man knows this, he really knows everything. You misunderstood me, said G. I was not speaking of the philosophical significance of the aim of existence. Man does not know it, and he cannot know it so long as he remains what he is, first of all, because there is not one but many aims of existence. On the contrary, attempts to answer this question using ordinary methods are utterly hopeless and useless. I was asking about an entirely different thing. I was asking about your personal aim, about what you want to attain, and not about the reason for your existence. Everyone must have his own aim. One man wants riches, another health, a third wants the kingdom of heaven, the fourth wants to be a general, and so on. It is about aims of this sort that I am asking. If you tell me what your aim is, I shall be able to tell you whether we are going along the same road or not. Think of how you formulated your own aim to yourselves before you came here. I formulated my own aim quite clearly several years ago, I said. I said to myself then that I want to know the future. Through a theoretical study of the question, I came to the conclusion that the future can be known, and several times I was even successful in experiments in knowing the exact future. I concluded from this that we ought, and that we have a right to know, the future, and that until we know it, we shall not be able to organise our lives. A great deal was connected for me with this question. I considered, for instance, that a man can know, and has a right to know, exactly how much time is left to him, how much time he has at his disposal, or, in other words, he can and has a right to know the day and hour of his death. I always thought it humiliating for a man to live without knowing this, and I decided at one time not to begin doing anything in any sense whatever until I did know it. For what is the good of beginning any kind of work when one doesn't know whether one will have time to finish it or not? Very well, said G. To know the future is the first aim. Who else can formulate his aim? I should like to be convinced that I shall go on existing after the death of the physical body, or, if this depends upon me, I should like to work in order to exist after death, said one of the company. I don't care whether I know the future or not, or whether I am certain or not certain of life after death, said another. If I remain what I am now, what I feel most strongly is that I am not master of myself. If I were to formulate my aim, I should say that I want to be master of myself. I should like to understand the teaching of Christ and to be a Christian in the true sense of the term, said the next. I should like to be able to help people, said another. I should like to know how to stop wars, said another. Well, that's enough, said G. We have now sufficient material to go on with. The best formulation of those that have been put forward is the wish to be one's own master. Without this, nothing else is possible, and without this, nothing else will have any value. But let us begin with the first question or the first aim. In order to know the future, it is necessary first to know the present in all its details, as well as to know the past. Today is what it is because yesterday was what it was. And if today is like yesterday, tomorrow will be like today. If you want tomorrow to be different, you must take today different. If today is simply a consequence of yesterday, tomorrow will be a consequence of today in exactly the same way. And if one has studied thoroughly what happened yesterday, the day before yesterday, a week ago, a year, 10 years ago, one can say unmistakably what will and what will not happen tomorrow. But at present we have not sufficient material at our disposal to discuss this question seriously. What happens or may happen to us may depend upon three causes: upon accident, upon fate, or upon our own will. Such as we are almost wholly dependent upon accident. We can have no fate in the real sense of the word, any more than we can have will. If we had will, then through this alone we should know the future, because we should then make our future and make it such as we want it to be. If we had fate, we could also know the future, because fate corresponds to type. If the type is known, then its fate can be known. That is, both the past and the future. But accidents cannot be foreseen. Today a man is one, tomorrow he is different. Today one thing happens to him, tomorrow another. But are you not able to foresee what is going to happen to each of us? Somebody asked. That is to say, foretell what result each of us will reach in work on himself, and whether it is worth his while to begin work. It is impossible to say, said G. One can only foretell the future for men. It is impossible to foretell the future for mad machines. Their direction changes every moment. At one moment a machine of this kind is going in one direction, and you can calculate where it can get to. But 5 minutes later it is already going in quite a different direction, and all your calculations prove to be wrong. Therefore, before talking about knowing the future, one must know whose future is meant. If a man wants to know his own future, he must first of all know himself. Then he will see whether it is worth his while to know the future. Sometimes, maybe, it is better not to know it. It sounds paradoxical, but we have every right to say that we know our future. It will be exactly the same as our past has been. Nothing can change of itself. And in practice, in order to study the future, one must learn to notice and to remember the moments when we really know the future and when we act in accordance with this knowledge. Then, judging by results, it will be possible to demonstrate that we really do know the future. This happens in a simple way in business, for instance. Every good commercial businessman knows the future. If he does not know the future, his business goes smash. In work on oneself, one must be a good businessman, a good merchant, and knowing the future is worthwhile only when a man can be his own master. There was a question here about the future life, about how to create it, how to avoid final death, how not to die. For this it is necessary to be. If a man is changing every minute, if there is nothing in him that can withstand external influences, it means that there is nothing in him that can withstand death. But if he becomes independent of external influences, if there appears in him something that can live by itself, this something may not die. In ordinary circumstances we die every moment. External influences change and we change with them. That is, many of our eyes die. If a man develops in himself a permanent eye that can survive a change in external conditions, it can survive the death of the physical body. The whole secret is that one cannot work for a future life without working for this one. In working for life, a man works for death, or rather, for immortality. Therefore, work for immortality, if one may so call it, cannot be separated from general work. In attaining the one, a man attains the other. A man may strive to be simply for the sake of his own life's interests. Through this alone he may become immortal. We do not speak specially of a future life, and we do not study whether it exists or not, because the laws are everywhere the same. In studying his own life as he knows it, and the lives of other men from birth to death, a man is studying all the laws which govern life and death and immortality. If he becomes the master of his life, he may become the master of his death. Another question was how to become a Christian. First of all, it is necessary to understand that a Christian is not a man who calls himself a Christian or whom others call a Christian. A Christian is one who lives in accordance with Christ's precepts. Such as we are, we cannot be Christians. In order to be Christians, we must be able to do. We cannot do. With us, everything happens. Christ says, "Love your enemies." But how can we love our enemies when we cannot even love our friends? Sometimes it loves, and sometimes it does not love. Such as we are, we cannot even really desire to be Christians because, again, sometimes it desires and sometimes it does not desire. And one and the same thing cannot be desired for long because suddenly, instead of desiring to be a Christian, a man remembers a very good but very expensive carpet that he has seen in a shop. And instead of wishing to be a Christian, he begins to think how he can manage to buy this carpet, forgetting all about Christianity. Or, if somebody else does not believe what a wonderful Christian he is, he will be ready to eat him alive or to roast him on hot coals. In order to be a good Christian, one must be. To be means to be master of oneself. If a man is not his own master, he has nothing and can have nothing, and he cannot be a Christian. He is simply a machine, an automaton. A machine cannot be a Christian. Think for yourselves. Is it possible for a motor car or a typewriter or a gramophone to be Christian? They are simply things which are controlled by chance. They are not responsible. They are machines. To be a Christian means to be responsible. Responsibility comes later when a man even partially ceases to be a machine and begins, in fact, and not only in words, to desire to be a Christian. What is the relation of the teaching you are expounding to Christianity as we know it? Asked someone present. I do not know what you know about Christianity, answered G, emphasising this word. It would be necessary to talk a great deal and to talk for a long time in order to make clear what you understand by this term. But for the benefit of those who know already, I will say that, if you like, this is esoteric Christianity. We will talk in due course about the meaning of these words. At present, we will continue to discuss our questions. Of the desires expressed, the one which is most right is the desire to be master of oneself, because without this nothing else is possible. And in comparison with this desire, all other desires are simply childish dreams, desires of which a man can make no use even if they were granted to him. It was said, for instance, that somebody wanted to help people. In order to be able to help people, one must first learn to help oneself. A great number of people become absorbed in thoughts and feelings about helping others simply out of laziness. They are too lazy to work on themselves, and at the same time it is very pleasant for them to think that they are able to help others. This is being false and insincere with oneself. If a man looks at himself as he really is, he will not begin to think of helping other people. He will be ashamed to think about it. Love of mankind, altruism, are all very fine words, but they only have meaning when a man is able, of his own choice and of his own decision, to love or not to love, to be an altruist or an egoist. Then his choice has a value. But if there is no choice at all, if he cannot be different, if he is only such as chance has made or is making him, an altruist today, an egoist tomorrow, again an altruist the day after tomorrow, then there is no value in it whatever. In order to help others, one must first learn to be an egoist, a conscious egoist. Only a conscious egoist can help people. Such as we are, we can do nothing. A man decides to be an egoist but gives away his last shirt instead. He decides to give away his last shirt, but instead he strips of his last shirt the man to whom he meant to give his own. Or he decides to give away his own shirt, but gives away somebody else's and is offended if somebody refuses to give him his shirt so that he may give it to another. This is what happens most often, and so it goes on. And above all, in order to do what is difficult, one must first learn to do what is easy. One cannot begin with the most difficult. There was a question about war. How to stop wars? Wars cannot be stopped. War is the result of the slavery in which men live. Strictly speaking, men are not to blame for war. War is due to cosmic forces, to planetary influences. But in men there is no resistance whatever against these influences, and there cannot be any because men are slaves. If they were men, and were capable of doing, they would be able to resist these influences and refrain from killing one another. But surely those who realise this can do something, said the man who had asked the question about war. If a sufficient number of men came to a definite conclusion that there should be no war, could they not influence others? Those who dislike war have been trying to do so almost since the creation of the world, said G, and yet there has never been such a war at the present. Wars are not decreasing, they are increasing, and war cannot be stopped by ordinary means. All these theories about universal peace, about peace conferences and so on, again, simply laziness and hypocrisy. Men do not want to think about themselves, do not want to work on themselves, but think of how to make other people do what they want. If a sufficient number of people who wanted to stop war really did gather together, they would first of all begin by making war upon those who disagreed with them. And it is still more certain that they would make war on people who also want to stop wars, but in another way. And so they would fight. Men are what they are, and they cannot be different. War has many causes that are unknown to us. Some causes are in men themselves, others are outside them. One must begin with the causes that are in man himself. How can he be independent of the external influences of great cosmic forces when he is the slave of everything that surrounds him? He is controlled by everything around him. If he becomes free from things, he may then become free from planetary influences. Freedom, liberation, this must be the aim of man. To become free, to be liberated from slavery. That is what a man ought to strive for when he becomes even a little conscious of his position. There is nothing else for him, and nothing else is possible so long as he remains a slave both inwardly and outwardly. But he cannot cease to be a slave outwardly while he remains a slave inwardly. Therefore, in order to become free, man must gain inner freedom. The first reason for man's inner slavery is his ignorance, and above all its ignorance of himself. Without self-knowledge, without understanding the working and functions of his machine, man cannot be free. He cannot govern himself and will always remain a slave and the plaything of the forces acting upon him. This is why in all ancient teachings the first demand at the beginning of the way to liberation was, "Know thyself." We shall speak of these words now. The next lecture began precisely with the words, "Know thyself." These words, said G, which are generally ascribed to Socrates, actually lie at the basis of many systems and schools far more ancient than the Socratic. But although modern thought is aware of the existence of this principle, it has only a very vague idea of its meanings and significance. The ordinary man of our times, even a man with philosophic or scientific interests, does not realise that the principle "know thyself" speaks of the necessity of knowing one machine, the human machine. Machines are made more or less the same way in all men. Therefore, before anything else, man must study the structure, the functions, and the laws of his organism. In the human machine, everything is so interconnected. One thing is so dependent upon another that it is quite impossible to study any one function without studying all the others. In order to know one thing, one must know everything. To know everything in man is possible, but it requires much time and labour, and above all the application of the right method, and what is equally necessary, right guidance. The principle, "Know thyself," embraces a very rich content. It demands in the first place that a man who wants to know himself should understand what this means, with what is connected, what it necessarily depends upon. Knowledge of oneself is a very big, but a very vague and distant aim. Man in his present state is very far from self-knowledge. Therefore, strictly speaking, his aim cannot even be defined as self-knowledge. Self-study must be his big aim. It is quite enough if a man understands that he must study himself. It must be man's aim to begin to study himself, to know himself in the right way. Self-study is the work or the way which leads to self-knowledge. But in order to study oneself, one must first learn how to study, where to begin, what methods to use. A man must learn how to study himself, and he must study the methods of self-study. The chief method of self-study is self-observation. Without properly applied self-observation, a man will never understand the connection and the correlation between the various functions of his machine, will never understand how and why on each separate occasion everything in him happens. But to learn the methods of self-observation and of right self-study requires a certain understanding of the functions and the characteristics of the human machine. Thus, in observing the functions of the human machine, it is necessary to understand the correct divisions of the functions observed, and to be able to define them exactly and at once, and the definition must not be a verbal, but an inner definition, by taste, by sensation, in the same way as we define all inner experiences. There are two methods of self-observation: analysis, or attempts at an analysis, that is, attempts to find the answers to the questions, upon what does a certain thing depend, and why does it happen? And the second method is registering, simply recording in one's mind what is observed at the moment. Self-observation, especially in the beginning, must on our account become an analysis or attempts at an analysis. Analysis will only become possible much later, when a man knows all the functions of his machine and all the laws which govern it. In trying to analyse some phenomenon that he came across within himself, a man generally asks, "What is this? Why does it happen in this way and not in some other way?" And he begins to seek an answer to these questions, forgetting all about further observations. Becoming more and more engrossed in these questions, he completely loses the thread of self-observation and even forgets about it. Observation stops. It is clear from this that only one thing can go on, either observation or attempts at an analysis. But even apart from this, attempts to analyse separate phenomena without a knowledge of general laws are a completely useless waste of time. Before it is possible to analyse even the most elementary phenomena, a man must accumulate a sufficient quantity of material by means of recording. Recording, that is, the result of a direct observation of what is taking place at a given moment, is the most important material in the work of self-study. When a certain number of records have been accumulated, and when, at the same time, laws to a certain extent have been studied and understood, analysis becomes possible. From the very beginning, observation, or recording, must be based upon the understanding of the fundamental principles of the activity of the human machine. Self-observation cannot be properly applied without knowing these principles, without constantly bearing them in mind. Therefore, ordinary self-observation, in which all people are engaged all their lives, is entirely useless and leads nowhere. Observation must begin with the divisions of functions. All the activity of the human machine is divided into 4 sharply defined groups, each of which is controlled by its own special mind or centre. In observing himself, a man must differentiate between the 4 basic functions of his machine: the thinking, the emotional, the moving, and the instinctive. Every phenomenon that a man observes in himself is related to one or the other of these functions. Therefore, before beginning to observe, a man must understand how the functions differ, what intellectual activity means, what emotional activity means, what moving activity means, and what instinctive activity means. Observation must begin from the beginning. All previous experience, the results of all previous self-observation, must be laid aside. They may contain much valuable material, but all this material is based upon wrong divisions of the functions observed and is itself wrongly divided. It cannot, therefore, be utilised. At any rate, it cannot be utilised at the beginning of the work of self-study. What is of value in it will, at the proper time, be taken up and made use of. But it is necessary to begin from the beginning. A man must begin observing himself as though he did not know himself at all, as though he had never observed himself. When he begins to observe himself, he must try to determine at once to what group, to which centre, belong the phenomena he is observing at the moment. Some people find it difficult to understand the difference between thought and feeling. Others have difficulty in understanding the difference between feeling and sensation, between a thought and a moving impulse. Speaking on very broad lines, one may say that the thinking function always works by means of comparison. Intellectual conclusions are always the result of the comparison of 2 or more impressions. Sensation and emotion do not reason, do not compare. They simply define a given impression by its aspect, by its being pleasant or unpleasant in one sense or another, by its colour, taste or smell. Moreover, sensations can be indifferent, neither warm nor cold, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, white paper, red pencil. In the sensation of white or red there is nothing either pleasant or unpleasant. At any rate, there need not necessarily be anything pleasant or unpleasant connected with this or that colour. These sensations, the so-called five senses, and others like the feeling of warmth, cold and so on, are instinctive. Feeling functions or emotions are always pleasant or unpleasant. Indifferent emotions do not exist. The difficulty of distinguishing between the functions is increased by the fact that people differ very much in the way they feel their functions. This is what we do not generally understand. We take people to be much more alike than they really are. In reality, however, there exist between them great differences in the forms and methods of their perception. Some perceive chiefly through their mind, others through their feeling, and others through sensation. It is very difficult, almost impossible for men of different categories and of different modes of perception to understand one another, because they call one and the same thing by different names, and they call different things by the same name. Besides this, various other combinations are possible. One man perceives by thoughts and sensations, another by thought and feelings, and so on. One or another mode of perception is immediately connected with one or another kind of reaction to external events. The result of this difference in perception and reaction to external events is expressed in the first place by the fact that people do not understand one another, and in the second by the fact that they do not understand themselves. Very often, a man calls his thoughts or his intellectual perceptions his feelings, calls his feelings his thoughts and his sensations his feelings. The last is the most common. If two people perceive the same thing differently, let us say that one perceives it through feeling and another through sensation, they might argue all their lives and never understand in what consists the difference of their attitude to a given object. Actually, one sees one aspect of it and the other a different aspect. In order to find a way of discriminating, we must understand that every normal psychic function is a means or an instrument of knowledge. With the help of the mind, we see one aspect of things and events. With the help of emotions, another aspect. With the help of sensations, a third aspect. The most complete knowledge of a given subject possible for us can only be obtained if we examine it simultaneously with our mind, feelings and sensations. Every man who is striving after right knowledge must aim at the possibility of attaining such perception. In ordinary conditions, man sees the world through a crooked, uneven window. And even if he realises this, he cannot alter anything. This or that mode of perception depends upon the work of his organism as a whole. All functions are interconnected and counterbalance one another. All functions strive to keep one another in the state in which they are. Therefore, when a man begins to study himself, he must understand that if he discovers in himself something that he dislikes, he will not be able to change it. To study is one thing, and to change is another. But study is the first step towards the possibility of change in the future. And in the beginning, to study himself, he must understand that for a long time, all his work will consist in study only. Change under ordinary conditions is impossible because in wanting to change something, a man wants to change this one thing only. But everything in the machine is interconnected and every function is inevitably counterbalanced by some other function or by a whole series of functions, although we are not aware of this interconnection of the various functions within ourselves. The machine is balanced all its details at every moment of its activity. If a man observes in himself something that he dislikes and begins making efforts to alter it, he may succeed in obtaining a certain result. But together with this result, he will inevitably obtain another result, which he did not in the least expect or desire, and which he could not have suspected. By striving to destroy and annihilate everything that he dislikes, by making efforts to this end, he upsets the balance of the machine. The machine strives to re-establish the balance, and re-establishes it by creating a new function which the man could not have foreseen. For instance, a man may observe that he is very absent-minded, that he forgets everything, loses everything, and so on. He begins to struggle with this habit and, if he is sufficiently methodical and determined, he succeeds after a time, in attaining the desired result. He ceases to forget and to lose things. This he notices, but there is something else he does not notice, which other people notice, namely that he has grown irritable, pedantic, fault-finding, disagreeable. Irritability has appeared as the result of his having lost his absent-mindedness. Why? It is impossible to say. Only detailed analysis of a particular man's mental qualities can show why the loss of one quality has caused the appearance of another. This does not mean that loss of absent-mindedness must necessarily give rise to irritability. It is just as easy for some other characteristic to appear that has no relation to absent-mindedness at all, for instance stinginess or envy or something else. So that if one is working on oneself properly, one must consider the possible supplementary changes and take them into account beforehand. Only in this way is it possible to avoid undesirable changes of the appearance of qualities which are utterly opposed to the aim and the direction of the work. But in the general plan of the work and functions of the human machine, there are certain points in which a change may be brought about without giving rise to any supplementary results. It is necessary to know what these points are, and it is necessary to know how to approach them, for if one does not begin with them, one will either get no result at all, or wrong and undesirable results. Having fixed in his own mind the difference between the intellectual, the emotional, and the moving function, a man must, as he observes himself, immediately refer his impressions to this or that category. And at first he must take mental note of only such observations as regards which he has no doubt whatever, that is, those where he sees at once to what category they belong. He must reject all vague or doubtful cases and remember only those which are unquestionable. If the work is carried on properly, the number of unquestionable observations will rapidly increase, and that which seemed doubtful before will be clearly seen to belong to the first, the second, the third centre. Each centre has its own memory, its own associations, its own thinking. As a matter of fact, each centre consists of three parts: the thinking, the emotional, and the moving. But we know very little about this side of our nature. In each centre we know only one part. Self-observation, however, will very quickly show us that our mental life is much richer than we think, or in any case that it contains more possibilities than we think. At the same time, as we watch the work of the centres, we should observe, side by side with their right working, their wrong working, that is, the working of one centre for another, the attempts of the thinking centre to feel or to pretend that it feels, the attempts of the emotional centre to think, the attempts of the moving centre to think and feel. As has been said already, one centre working for another is useful in certain cases, for it preserves the continuity of mental activity. But in becoming habitual, it becomes at the same time harmful, since it begins to interfere with right work by enabling each centre to shirk its own direct duties and to do not what it ought to be doing, but what it likes best at the moment. In a normal healthy man, each centre does its own work, that is, the work for which it was specially destined and which it can best perform. There are situations in life which the thinking centre alone can deal with and can find a way out of. If at this moment the emotional centre begins to work instead, it will make a muddle of everything, and the result of its interference will be most unsatisfactory. In an unbalanced kind of man, the substitution of one centre for another goes on almost continually, and this is precisely what being unbalanced or neurotic means. Each centre strives, as it were, to pass its work on to another, and at the same time it strives to do the work of another centre for which it is not fitted. The emotional centre working for the thinking centre brings unnecessary nervousness, feverishness, and hurry into situations where, on the contrary, calm judgment and deliberation are essential. The thinking centre working for the emotional centre brings deliberation into situations which require quick decisions and makes a man incapable of distinguishing the peculiarities and the fine points of the position. Thought is too slow. It works out a certain plan of action and continues to follow it even though the circumstances have changed and quite a different course of action is necessary. Besides, in some cases the interference of the thinking centre gives rise to entirely wrong reactions because the thinking centre is simply incapable of understanding the shades and distinctions of many events. Events that are quite different for the moving centre and for the emotional centre appear to be alike to it. Its decisions are much too general and do not correspond to the decisions which the emotional centre would have made. This becomes perfectly clear if we imagine the interference of thought, that is, of the theoretical mind, in the domain of feeling, or of sensation, or of movement. In all three cases, the interference of the mind leads to wholly undesirable results. The mind cannot understand shades of feeling. We see this clearly if we imagine one man reasoning about the emotions of another. He is not feeling anything himself, so the feelings of another do not exist for him. A full man does not understand a hungry one, but for the other they have a very definite existence. And the decisions of the first, that is of the mind, can never satisfy him. In exactly the same way, the mind cannot appreciate sensations. For it they are dead, nor is it capable of controlling movement. Instances of this kind are the easiest to find. Whatever work a man may be doing, it is enough for him to try to do each action deliberately, with his mind, following every movement, and he will see that the quality of his work will change immediately. If he is typing, his fingers, controlled by his moving centre, find the necessary letters themselves. But if he tries to ask himself before every letter, where is K, where is the comma, how is this word spelled, he at once begins to make mistakes or to write very slowly. If one drives a car with the help of one's mind, one can go only in the lowest gear. The mind cannot keep pace with all the movements necessary for developing a greater speed. To drive at full speed, especially in the streets of a large town, while steering with the help of one's mind, is absolutely impossible for an ordinary man. Moving centre working for thinking centre produces, for example, mechanical reading or mechanical listening, as when a man reads or listens to nothing but words, and is utterly unconscious of what he is reading or hearing. This generally happens when attention, that is the direction of the thinking centre's activity, is occupied with something else, and when the moving centre is trying to replace the absent thinking centre. But this very easily becomes a habit, because the thinking centre is generally distracted not by useful work, by thought or by contemplation, but simply by daydreaming or by imagination. Imagination is one of the principal sources of the wrong work of centres. Each centre has its own form of imagination and daydreaming, but as a rule, both the moving and the emotional centres make use of the thinking centres, which very readily places itself at their disposal for this purpose, because daydreaming corresponds to its own inclinations. Daydreaming is absolutely the opposite of useful mental activity. Useful in this case means activity directed towards a definite aim and undertaken for the sake of obtaining a definite result. Daydreaming does not pursue any aim, does not strive after any result. The motive for daydreaming always lies in the emotional or in the moving centre. The actual process is carried on by the thinking centre. The inclination to daydream is due partly to the laziness of the thinking centre, that is, its attempts to avoid the efforts connected with work directed towards a definite aim and going in a definite direction, and partly to the tendency of the emotional and the moving centres to repeat to themselves, to keep alive or to recreate experiences, both pleasant and unpleasant, that have been previously lived through or imagined. Daydreaming of disagreeable, morbid things is very characteristic of the unbalanced state of the human machine. After all, one can understand daydreaming of a pleasant kind and find logical justification for it. Daydreaming of an unpleasant character is an utter absurdity. And yet many people spend 9/10 of their lives in just such painful daydreams about misfortunes which may overtake them or their family, about illnesses they may contract or sufferings they will have to endure. Imagination and daydreaming are instances of the wrong work of the thinking centre. Observation of the activity of imagination and daydreaming forms a very important part of self-study. The next object of self-observation must be habits in general. Every grown-up man consists wholly of habits, although he is often unaware of it, and even denies having any habits at all. This can never be the case. All three centres are filled with habits, and a man can never know himself until he has studied all his habits. The observation and the study of habits is particularly difficult because, in order to see and record them, one must escape from them, free oneself from them, if only for a moment. So long as a man is governed by a particular habit, he does not observe it, but at the very first attempt, however feeble, to struggle against it, he feels it and notices it. Therefore, in order to observe and study habits, one must try to struggle against them. This opens up a practical method of self-observation. It has been said before that a man cannot change anything in himself, that he can only observe and record. This is true, but it is also true that a man cannot observe and record anything if he does not try to struggle with himself, that is, with his habits. This struggle cannot yield direct results, that is to say, it cannot lead to any change, especially to any permanent and lasting change. But it shows what is there. Without a struggle, a man cannot see what he consists of. The struggle with small habits is very difficult and boring, but without it self-observation is impossible. Even at the first attempt to study the elementary activity of the moving centre, a man comes up against habits. For instance, a man may want to study his movements, may want to observe how he walks, but he will never succeed in doing so for more than a moment if he continues to walk in the usual way. But if he understands that his usual way of walking consists of a number of habits, for instance, of taking steps of a certain length, walking at a certain speed and so on, and he tries to alter them, that is, to walk faster or slower, to take bigger or smaller steps, he will be able to observe himself and to study his movements as he walks. If a man wants to observe himself when he is writing, he must take note of how he holds his pen and try to hold it in a different way from usual. Observation will then become possible. In order to observe himself, a man must try to walk not in his habitual way. He must sit in unaccustomed attitudes. He must stand when he is accustomed to sit. He must sit when he is accustomed to stand. And he must make with his left hand the movements he is accustomed to make with his right hand and vice versa. All this will enable him to observe himself and study the habits and associations of the moving centre. In the sphere of the emotions, it is very useful to try to struggle with the habit of giving immediate expression to all one's unpleasant emotions. Many people find it very difficult to refrain from expressing their feelings about bad weather. It is still more difficult for people not to express unpleasant emotions when they feel that something or someone is violating what they may conceive to be order or justice. Besides being a very good method for self-observation, the struggle against expressing unpleasant emotions has at the same time another significance. It is one of the few directions in which a man can change himself or his habits without creating other undesirable habits. Therefore, self-observation and self-study must, from the first, be accompanied by the struggle against the expression of unpleasant emotions. If he carries out all these rules while he observes himself, a man will record a whole series of very important aspects of his being. To begin with, he will record with unmistakable clearness the fact that his actions, thoughts, feelings and words are the result of external influences and that nothing comes from himself. He will understand and see that he is in fact an automaton acting upon the influences of external stimuli. He will feel his complete mechanicalness. Everything happens. He cannot do anything. He is a machine controlled by accidental shocks from outside. Each shock calls to the surface one of his eyes. A new shock and that eye disappears and a different one takes its place. Another small change in the environment and again there is a new eye. a man will begin to understand that he has no control of himself whatever, that he does not know what he may say or do the next moment. He will begin to understand that he cannot answer for himself even for the shortest length of time. He will understand that if he remains the same and does nothing unexpected, it is simply because no unexpected outside changes are taking place. He will understand that his actions are entirely controlled by external conditions, and he will be convinced that there is nothing permanent in him from which control could come, not a single permanent function, not a single permanent state. There were several points in G's psychological theories that particularly aroused my interest. The first thing was the possibility of self-change, that is, the fact that in beginning to observe himself in the right way, a man immediately begins to change himself, and that he can never find himself to be right. The second thing was the demand not to express unpleasant emotions. I at once felt something big behind this, and the future showed that I was right, for the study of emotions and the work on emotions became the basis of the subsequent development of the whole system. But this was much later. The third thing which at once attracted my attention, and of which I began to think the very first time I heard of it, was the idea of the moving centre. The chief thing that interested me here was the question of the relation in which G placed moving functions to instinctive functions. Were they the same thing or were they different? And further, in what relation did the divisions made by G stand to the divisions customary in ordinary psychology? With certain reservations and additions, I had considered it possible to accept the old divisions, that is, to divide man's actions into conscious actions, automatic actions, which must at first be conscious, instinctive actions, expedient but without consciousness of purpose, and reflexes, simple and complex, which are never conscious and which can, in certain cases, be inexpedient. In addition, there were actions performed under the influence of hidden emotional dispositions or inner, unknown impulses. G turned all this structure upside down. First of all, he completely rejected conscious actions because, as it appeared from what he said, there was nothing that was conscious. The term subconscious, which plays such a big part in the theories of some authors, became quite useless and even misleading because phenomena of quite different categories were classified under the category of subconscious. The division of actions according to the centres controlling them did away with all uncertainty and all possible doubts as to the correctness of these divisions. What was particularly important in G's system was the indication that the same actions could originate in different centres. An example is the recruit and the old soldier at rifle drill. One has to perform the drill with his thinking centre, the other does it with the moving centre, which does it much better. But G did not call actions governed by the moving centre automatic. He used the name automatic only for the actions which a man performs imperceptibly for himself. If the same actions are observed by a man, they cannot be called automatic. He allotted a big place to automatism, but regarded the moving functions as distinct from the automatic functions and, what is most important, he found automatic actions in all centres. He spoke, for instance, of automatic thoughts and of automatic feelings. When I asked him about reflexes, he called them instinctive actions. And as I understood from what followed, among external movements, he considered only reflexes to be instinctive actions. I was very interested in the interrelation of moving and instinctive functions in his description, and I often returned to this subject in my talks with him. First of all, G drew attention to the constant misuse of the words instinct and instinctive. It transpired from what he said that these words could be applied, by rights, only to the inner functions of the organism, the beating of the heart, breathing, the circulation of blood, digestion. These were instinctive functions. The only external functions that belong to this category are reflexes. The difference between instinctive and moving functions was as follows. The moving functions of man, as well as of animals, of a bird, of a dog, must be learned, but instinctive functions are inborn. A man has very few inborn external movements. An animal has more, though they vary. Some have more, others have less. But that which is usually explained as instinct is very often a series of complex moving functions which young animals learn from older ones. One of the chief properties of the moving centre is its ability to imitate. The moving centre imitates what it sees without reasoning. This is the origin of the legends that exist about the wonderful intelligence of animals, or the instinct that takes the place of intelligence and makes them perform a whole series of very complex and expedient actions. The idea of an independent moving centre which, on the one hand, does not depend upon the mind, does not require the mind, and which is a mind in itself, and which, on the other hand, does not depend upon instinct, and is first of all to learn, placed very many problems on entirely new ground. The existence of a moving centre works by means of imitation, explains the preservation of the existing order in beehives, termitaries, and ant hills. Directed by imitation, one generation has had to shape itself absolutely upon the model of another. There could be no changes, no departure whatever from the model. But imitation did not explain how such an order was arrived at in the first place. I often wanted very much to speak to G about this, as well as about many other things connected with it. But G eluded such conversations by leading them up to man and to real problems of self-study. Then a great deal was elucidated for me by the idea that each centre was not only a motive force, but also a receiving apparatus, working as receiver for different and sometimes very distant influences. When I thought of what had been said about wars, revolutions, migrations of peoples and so on, when I pictured how masses of humanity could move under the control of planetary influences, I began to understand our fundamental mistake in determining the actions of an individual. We regard the actions of an individual as originating in himself. We do not imagine that the masses may consist of automatons obeying external stimuli and may move, not under the influence of the will, consciousness, or inclination of individuals, but under the influence of external stimuli coming possibly from very far away. Can the instinctive and the moving functions be controlled by two distinct centres? I asked G once. They can, said G, and to them must be added the sex centre. These are the three centres of the lower story. The sex centre is the neutralising centre in relation to the instinctive and the moving centres. The lower story can exist by itself because the three centres in it are the conductors of the three forces. The thinking and the emotional centres are not indispensable for life. Which of them is active and which is passive in the lower story? It changes, said G. One moment the moving centre is active and the instinctive passive. Another moment the instinctive is active and the moving is passive. You must find examples of both states in yourself. But besides different states, there are also different types. In some people the moving centre is more active, in others the instinctive centre. But for the sake of convenience in reasoning, and particularly in the beginning, when it is important only to explain the principles, we take them as one centre with different functions which are on the same level. If you take the thinking, the emotional and the moving centres, then they work on different levels, the moving and the instinctive on one level. Later you will understand what these levels mean and upon what they depend.